Well, and it's not that there's an educational crisis happening now. There's been an educational crisis happening since the dawn of public education. That's what other people don't realize. Like most people don't, they don't think there's one now, and they don't realize that there always has been one. There's never been a time where there's not been one. If you consider a majority of American students below proficiency a crisis, as I do. So there's never been a time in our country's history when a majority of students have been at the proficient level, not once. And there's always this reference to,
Hey, Nick Nanton here, and thanks for tuning in to Now to Next. I want to make sure you don't miss a single episode of this show on YouTube. So before we continue, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. You have the option to be notified for occasional videos or all of them. If you're on your phone, just go into your settings and switch on notifications. Thanks for watching. Hey everybody, welcome back to Now to Next with Nick Nanton. There's lots of N's in that. Hope you enjoy that alliteration as we're talking about learning. I'll bring back my my school learnedness. I got a great guest for you here, Dr. Kimberly Berens, and you can see her, so I might as well say hello now. How are you doing, Kimberly?
Hi, I'm good. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. So I'm going to give a brief bio in a second, but basically I was out doing interviews for a documentary that we were making called The Truth About Reading with the John Corcoran Foundation and our friend Nora Chabazi. And she introduced us to you. And I had a conversation with you that I looked at the other day. We had a 90-minute conversation on camera, which I don't normally have the attention span for that. I guess that would be pathologized as ADHD, as we will talk about later.
Exactly.
But it was an amazing conversation. I think is an eye-opening conversation that so many parents need to hear. There's a lot of things that we're going to talk about today that for some funny reason, I can't quite figure out why they're controversial, but for some reason they create controversy. But there are so many things that if I were a parent with a struggling child in school, I'd want to hear about. I think, to set the tone, there are people who do have true disabilities, but there's a very, very, very small percentage of people. And so we're going to talk about how people get pushed into these boxes, how parents get pushed in these boxes. And as a parent who's not in the school system, we have to choose to be advocates for our children. But at some point we wonder, are we crazy and we just don't get it because we're made to feel these ways? And so I just thought it was a conversation that, first of all, I've privately shared your interview with a couple parent friends of mine who I'm just like, hey, keep your head up. There's a lot of hope. So let me give you a brief bio. We have so much to talk about. Here we go. Dr. Kimberly Nix Berens is the founder of Fit Learning and regional director of Fit Learning Tri-State. She's an educational researcher who has published and presented extensively on science-based approaches to education, speaking at over 30 regional, national, and international conferences. In 1998, as a doctoral student in learning and behavioral science, Dr. Behrens founded Fit Learning in a broom closet on campus at the University of Nevada, Reno. Since her humble beginnings, Dr. Behrens has driven the expansion of Fit Learning by establishing a formal certification in her method of instruction, which is called the Technology of Teaching. Fit Learning now has 31 locations worldwide, with 3 to 5 new locations opening each year. For the past 20 years, Dr. Behrens and her team have refined their system of instruction using behavioral and cognitive science. As a result, her system produces over 1 year of academic growth in just 40 hours of instruction. And based on what I've seen, that can be in almost any subject. Dr. Behrens currently lives in Long Island with her husband, Nick, and 2 children, Emma and Jack. She has a book out. It's her first book called Blind Spots: Why Students Fail and the Science That Can Save Them in the book. So, Kimberly, did I mess anything up or is that pretty close?
That was pretty good.
All right, good. Hey, I got a good team that helps me with my inconsistencies, so they're good. All right, so let's talk a little bit about you. Grew up in Atlanta, Georgia. Your dad was a psychiatrist. Your mom worked in the hospital system with children. Tell me about your path to becoming a behavioral scientist. I know at 5 years old, you were dreaming in your bedroom as a little girl. I cannot wait to be a behavioral scientist. So tell me about that journey.
Yeah, it definitely wasn't the case. So, I did have, influence from my whole family in a lot of ways, because I had a lot of medical doctors in my family, scientists, and my father was a physician and then eventually moved into psychiatry. So, he was always fascinated by why people do what they do, but he went at it from the medical angle, from the traditional kind of psychiatric angle. And I became interested in the sciences, really biology, in high school. And so when I went to Rollins College, right in your backyard, Nick,
It's
when
a
I went
great
to
place.
Rollins College, I really planned to, major in biology and minor in psychology. But I took my first intro to psychology course because I always thought, my dad was my influence in psychology. So I always thought psychology was kind of a bunch of fluffy theories, like people making up a theory about and just making stuff up. And I really was interested in the hard sciences. So I took my first intro to psychology class, and it was one of these intro classes where the experts in each area taught a section. And so for the learning course, like the learning section of the course, which was really the behavioral science section, this woman walked in, my mentor, who became my mentor, Maria Ruiz. She was a revered professor at Rollins College and unfortunately died tragically too early from cancer. But when she walked in the room, she was this tiny little Cuban lady. I mean, the tiniest person you've ever seen in your life walking in. And she started talking, and it was one of those moments where it was like a lightning bolt struck me in the face, where I was like, you mean there's a science, like a hard science that, behind human behavior and why we learn to do stuff? I just had no idea. I was used to it all being pathologies and pharmaceuticals and that stuff from my dad, not to throw him under the bus, but that was his angle. Right. So she just blew my mind. And so from that moment forward, I actually switched to majoring in psych and had less of an emphasis in bio at that point. And that was it. I mean, she became a mentor to me. I mean, that's one of the beauties of a small liberal arts college. It's almost like a graduate level education if you want it. So she became my mentor, and that was it. I started working in a residential treatment facility right in the Orlando area that was called Threshold. And it was for adults with profound disabilities, and was applying the principles of behavior there, and under another mentor named Ed Blakely, who's really big in Florida for this. And anyway, so that's kind of how I started. It was just an accident that this woman walked into my life and changed it forever, if you know what I mean.
That is often how it happens.
Yeah.
Talk a little about with Dr. Blakely. You did some work also, because I think it's interesting with autistic children. And yes. What I don't understand autism, I mean, I guess most of the world doesn't understand autism very well. Right. It's so complex, but it's interesting that it is a spectrum, which I would imagine every one of these learning challenges could be on a spectrum too. Like I might have problems with color, but I might have problems with it's just, so I think that to me that was informative of, you learned how to work on a spectrum, and I'm sure you saw all sorts of things. Tell me a little bit about working with autistic children. What were you able to learn anything or discover any breakthroughs, or what was that like?
Oh my gosh. So, I mean, that was the beginning of my career, was working with first adults and then children. I mean, I helped start a school in Orlando. I mean, again, winning the lottery all these many times, but Ed Blakely asked me to help start a preschool for kids with autism in Orlando, which was the first. This was back in the 90s, which is shocking because now early intervention for kids with autism is everywhere, but it wasn't. Even in the mid 90s, it wasn't. And so I helped as an undergrad, and then I took a gap year before grad school doing that with him, starting a preschool for kids with autism. And, here's the thing. Behavioral science is the science behind the learning process, which applies to every human being on the planet. But when you're dealing with kids who are on the spectrum that have such a profound barrier to learning from the natural environment, which is really, what is the main kind of characteristic of kids on the spectrum is they don't learn from the natural environment in the same way that, neurotypical children do. So their environments, all learners learn better with precisely designed environments, but children on the spectrum, they require precise design of the learning environment to acquire adaptive skills, to acquire language, and then eventually to acquire academic skills. So, I always say, for anyone entering the field of behavior science, it's always good to start with that type of population, because that's where the most rigorous and intensive kind of application of our science has to occur. because they're so challenging to teach, because there's so much going on there for they're inattentive. They tend to engage in some what we call kind of over selectivity, where they attend to irrelevant features of an aspect of the environment that then compete with them being able to learn the adaptive skill they need. I mean, there's a lot that you have to be such a profoundly creative and informed educator to teach those kids. And behavioral science is the only access to that. I mean, and also they have so much maladaptive behavior that can get in the way, which is, kind of comorbid with that diagnosis, mainly because they do struggle to learn language. And so they never transition out of that stage of tantruming and crying as the only form of communication that all kids are born doing. But then that eventually switches over to talking, whereas kids with autism don't necessarily make that switch on their own. So that crying repertoire, gets in the way of their learning a lot of things if you don't understand how to design environments according to behavioral science. So it's a profound learning process, starting in that realm.
Yeah, so that was obviously like a nuclear learning lab for you, with sort of the hardest cases. And you as you talk about in the book, you had an interest in helping people with disabilities, but then you found some pretty interesting things about like children without disabilities in the regular school system. And by the way, we'll talk about more, but that's public, private. It doesn't really matter based on the type of instruction that's going around. And what was happening in mainstream education. What happened next? So you're interested, you've been working at Quest, now you're getting your PhD. What's going on? What happens next?
Yeah, so I was accepted in the doctoral program at the University of Nevada, which was my first choice. It is an amazing behavioral science program there. So I moved out to Reno, Nevada. Random, right? I mean, I'm from Atlanta, I'm in Orlando. Then all of a sudden I'm heading out west with my husband, Nick Berens. We had gotten married and then we headed out west to move to Reno. And again, I was actually recruited to that program to run their autism program because they have, a big early intervention program for kids with autism. So I was actually kind of brought out there to do that, which I did. I ran that program for a few years. But again, there was this inkling underneath that we're making such profound impacts with all of these kids with profound disabilities. But I knew, I went through the school system, by luck. I, made it out and became successful, and I just knew what the school system actually produced just from my own life. And then I also knew because I was, I educated myself about it. And it was so shocking to me that the only place that behavior analysis or behavioral science was known was in the area of profound disabilities, where, teachers getting trained for mainstream education, in colleges of ed, zero training in behavioral science, the science behind the learning process, nowhere to be found. And, schools not designed based on it, instruction not designed based on it. It was just shocking to me. And we were just, our science is just kind of marginalized into these extreme realms of our culture where it's really, really a problem. And like, we're the only hope. But then when it comes to like kids who can, it's just kind of sloppy in the mainstream world. So it was infuriating to me. And then there was 2 other grad students that felt the same. And, we all got to hear this amazing guy in my field, Carl Binder, speak at a conference. And he talked about, the application of this to instruction. And we all were like, that's it. Like, we're starting a pilot project at UNR, because UNR wasn't doing this at all. Like, we weren't doing mainstream education work. So we just started, we asked the faculty and they were like, go for it. We're not paying you. I mean, it's all volunteer, like in your spare time, which is not a lot when you're a doctoral student, but whatever. Yeah. So we and the only space we could get on campus was this creepy janitor's closet that we turned into a session room and tried to make not look like a serial killer's lair. I think we did an okay job, but I don't know. Parents brought their kids there. So anyway, so it started out as this just really podunk, duct tape together thing. But, we had science on our side, man. And when you have science on your side, evolution and progress and advancement is ensured. I mean, and that's just what happened. I mean, we just did the work. We did the science and we were careful and precise. And we held our values, which was, applying the science and ensuring we're being effective. And over time, we just gradually got moved to bigger and bigger classrooms as the program became more and more popular. And then the Reno Gazette-Journal did a big article on us, and that was it. Everything exploded. And then the College of Education got really mad at us because they had an after-school tutoring program and they were losing kids in droves over to the behavior science program. And, the people over there were like, behavior scientists have no business working and reading and mathematics. Anyway, so they had a lot more money than we did. We were the rejects, at table 10. Like we were in the old crappy buildings, the behavior science people, like the rejects over here. So they had a lot more power with the university and they shut us down. And so that was when my husband had gotten involved as well. Like he was also a graduate student. He had gotten interested and involved, and we both were like, this can't happen. Like, this cannot happen. They can't cut us, shut this down. The people in the community were outraged. So we were in graduate school still with a baby daughter. And we were like, all right, I guess we're starting a business, which I had known nothing about. Didn't even have a business plan. Anyway, so we started a private company off campus, and we still maintained an affiliation with the university where we had graduate students coming to get training, and had a research lab. And anyway, so that's how it started. And now 35, almost 37 locations later, here we are.
I love it. And so one thing that I loved about speaking with you and many people who speak about education this way, let's talk about teachers for a minute. Let's talk about, because if someone just tuned in right there, they might think you are angry at teachers, blaming teachers. I know that not to be true, but tell me about teachers and the system that they're in, and your opinion on that.
Well, one of the most damaging myths in our culture is the myth of talent. And, that's everywhere. But for my personal and professional world, where it's most damaging is in the area of teaching. Because when teachers go into colleges of education, it's instantiated that you're either a good teacher or you're a bad teacher. And if you're a good teacher, it's almost inherently part of your personality. It's almost like a part of your being. It's like who you are as a person. And it's this mystical thing. As if it's not a repertoire of behavior you can teach. So it becomes extremely personal, right? It's an extremely personal thing. So what I say about teachers is teachers are victims of inadequate training, period. Being an effective educator is a repertoire of behavior that requires effective instruction and repeated reinforced practice to mastery. Just like everything else that we learn in life. I mean, just like the way I teach my kids at FIT to read or do math or think or write, I teach the people I certify people to do this instructional methodology in the same exact way. So when you demystify a behavioral repertoire and actually identify the essential component skills involved in that repertoire and identify how to measure them, first of all, how to teach people to do them, how to measure their doing of them, and how to evaluate when they've mastered doing it by evaluating their behavior and the outcomes produced with their students, then it's like effective action is possible, and you can teach people to be better at their job. So, when teachers struggle, they struggle because they're not trained to be effective. They're actually trained to not be effective, to be quite honest, because a lot of what they're trained to do in the College of Education is all based on theories and belief systems that have no empirical basis, that are actually completely contradictory to what we know about the learning process from a scientific perspective. Teachers, unfortunately, aren't even given the opportunity to learn that stuff. So they're given a bunch of theories, and they're taught about self-esteem, and, the exploratory learning, and, all this warm and fuzzy stuff. And then they're thrown to the wolves and expected to be effective when they've never been taught to be effective at all. And some teachers figure it out on their own by luck, whatever it may be. There's some teachers who get it, but there's some that don't. And there's no fault there. There's no fault. The fault is the system doesn't work, and teacher training programs are ineffective. Even teachers who actually know how to be effective, they're they're not supported to be effective by the way the system is designed. They're not allowed to be. They're not able to be. So teachers have absolutely no power. They are completely disempowered. They're disempowered by their training, and they're disempowered by the system in which they're forced to work, which is why the recidivism rate is so high. I mean, it's a really tough. I mean, look, even as a profoundly effective educator like I am and the people I train, it's hard. It's hard even when you're really good at this, because you're trained well, not because you're talented, because you're trained well. So, teachers deserve to be trained to be effective. And then they deserve to be empowered to be allowed to be in charge and be effective in their classrooms. And none of those things are the case at this point.
Yeah, it's interesting. From some of the teachers who I've interviewed, and I would understand this being in their position, there's sort of like three phases of this. There's like, they hear this for the first time, and they basically think you're a jerk, or whoever is trumpeting the message because you're trying to help people. They're like, oh my gosh, what a jerk coming after me. And then some of them realize that there's a small group of them that dig in deeper. And then from my experience, oh, wait a minute, there's something to this. And then they get angry. And they get angry because they're stuck in a system that doesn't really support this. And by the way, as we'll talk about, I mean, I've been doing mostly this work in reading, you do it in learning, but there's a percentage of people who will just figure out how to learn. They'll just figure out how to read. It's just a percentage. And there's a percentage of teachers who will just figure out, despite inadequate training, as you call it, to teach. There are. We're not saying you're doomed for failure, but there's what I see is there's an awful lot of margin in here where even if you figured it out as a teacher and you have a certain percentage of kids who are figuring it out, there's a really wide gap of students who aren't figuring it out. And again, the system really is sort of an industrial revolution system, not designed around what each child actually needs. And I think any teacher who is a parent will just go to there, because again, none of this is meant to be putting down teachers, particularly an indictment on teachers, but it's meant to be, hey, maybe you should think this through. But every parent knows if you have more than one child, they need drastically different things. Like first time we had a kid, I'm like, oh, well, it's going to be a lot like me. Well, at least it'll be half me and half my wife, I guess. And then we have a kid and they're like, oh, that's a little bit different. Sort of. Okay. Now we're gonna have a second one. Well, at least the second one's gonna be like the first one. That didn't happen. And then the third one, it's like, people are all different, and this system is not really designed. I think even if you are somewhat angry as a teacher and educator watching this, what Kimberly says, like just think about this in other aspects of your life and you'll understand. And again, a teacher, you have the hardest job in the world. You got to get 20 to 40 ducklings to do the same thing, and they aren't all gifted the same way. Like that is super difficult. So there is a tendency to try to figure out why the kid is not doing particularly the harshest cases. I would imagine, again, if I were a teacher, I'm only going to deal with the harshest cases right now because I can get everybody sort of in the middle. I can actually maybe do the most effective job I can do based on the circumstances I've been given. So I want to make sure that we covered that. One of the things that we start then in your book, you start talking about the crisis. I think there's most people watching this don't realize there's an education crisis happening. I would have had zero clue. Give me a little bit on the stats of it that are verifiable, stats reported by government commissions and other things that will blow people's minds.
Well, and it's not that there's an educational crisis happening now. There's been an educational crisis happening since the dawn of public education. That's what other people don't realize. Like most people they don't think there's one now, and they don't realize that there always has been one. There's never been a time where there's not been one. If you consider a majority of American students below proficiency a crisis, as I do. So there's never been a time in our country's history when a majority of students have been at the proficient level, not once. And there's always this reference to, the good old days of schooling, during that post-World War II era, those kids were below proficiency too. So that's all myth. That's all myth. There was never a time when a majority of kids were being effectively educated, ever. So there's always been an educational crisis, and it's never not been one. So there's that. Across the board, in a general measure of students, more than 60% of kids are below proficiency in all academic subjects. So more than 60%. Now, when you start pulling out race and socioeconomic status, it becomes more and more horrifying. So more than 80% of children of color and those living in poverty are below proficiency in reading, and more than 90% of children of color are below proficiency in math and science. If that's not a crisis, I don't know what is. And the point is it's always been that way. Always. It's never not been that way.
That's crazy. And I think what's really interesting about it is, I know, again, there'd be a lot of people listening going, that can't be true. Like, I was fine. My friends turned out fine. And then where it seems to really come into play, and you even talked about it, like in the book, in your center you opened up at UNR, you had teachers and professors bringing you their kids. And then now that I've been interviewing all these, we're doing a project specifically on reading. You do more than reading, but a lot of people just do reading. A lot of teachers are bringing their kids, and they don't think about it or deal with it, and really deny it in a lot of cases until it hits your doorstep, which, by the way, I would be completely guilty of too. So I'm not, I'm in that same boat, but these stats sound ridiculous to believe. I'm sure there's a person of color mad at hearing 80%. That's racist. I'm sure there's someone in a regular,
it's not racist. It's just the data.
Right. But there are people who are going to be defensive about it. Right. And then there's people saying,
and why that, yes. And please, I mean, again, I'm very clear in my book that those data have nothing to do with those kids being less educable than white kids.
Sure, right.
Absolutely not.
That was the old racist, thought, obviously, but obviously not true. We know that. And obviously you mentioned too, that a lot of schools would think poor children, well, they weren't capable of learning well either. And so when it was the rich kids who couldn't read, they had to come up with a diagnosis. And that I remember
that's the only reason all these learning disabilities diagnoses, they started in the 1950s because rich white people were like, why can't my kid read? Oh, well, there has to be some pathology now besides these, children of color and these poor kids who are stupid. Now we've got to come up with a real reason why our schools are failing to, produce literate and numerate white kids.
Yeah.
I mean, if there's anything, to be honest with you, the learning disability racket is the biggest racist thing out there, because first they were invented to excuse failures by schools of rich white kids. Now it's an unbelievably disproportionate amount of kids of color who are classified with learning disabilities now, so that now there's this medical reason why schools are continuing to fail to effectively educate children of color. And it allows us to continue to not look at educational inequality, all of the things that are the real reasons why kids of color are failed across the board. I mean, most of the time. And it's really a crisis.
Yeah, so it allows the system to keep marginalizing them, and it actually just makes the margin wider and wider and wider. And what I thought was really interesting too, when the National Assessment of Educational Progress scores are evaluated, which I learned, this is NAEP, they call it, it's a national commission, right? With respect to socioeconomic level inequities are apparent, more than 80% of low-income eighth graders scored below proficiency in reading and math in 2019. Let me read that again. More than 80%, based on NAEP, you can go look it up, NAEP, National Assessment of Educational Progress, more than 80% of low-income eighth graders scored below proficiency in reading and math in 2019. Now, here's the other thing. People, particularly adults, if you look around and say, well, everyone around me is fine, this is garbage. People don't talk about these things. It's a shameful thing to not be able to read well or do math well or whatever. There's, I learned a term doing this documentary called subliteracy, and it made more sense to me. It was more like, it made more sense to me like food insecurity. It's not that a kid in a low-income neighborhood is going to go home and not get a single grape for the weekend. It's that they probably don't have enough resources to have 3 square meals. Oh, okay, that makes sense. Well, subliteracy doesn't mean illiteracy would be, I guess, you can't read anything, or that's what people think of it. But subliteracy makes sense to me. Like, no, we're interviewing a surgeon, by the way, who was subliterate, had to get private tutoring. We have, John Corcoran's amazing story being a teacher who couldn't read. I mean, these stories are happening all around you, and people just don't talk about them because there's so much shame associated with them. My hope with the documentary is to change the conversation from shame to one of, hey, let's start dealing with this. If you have an issue, don't be ashamed about it. There are actually things that can work. We were working with a guy, David. Oh, not we. I filmed it. It was my job was easy. That Nora was working with this gentleman, David, in his early 60s, who in like 6 days of instruction, I got to wait to see because it's been about a week, but he emailed me and said, Nick, you wouldn't believe he couldn't read well at all. And he had huge anxiety, negative self-talk. And we went to dinner the first night after his first lesson. And he said something, and I could tell he's a really good guy. He's a really bright guy. He used to fill in, I believe, for Bill Gates at speeches when Bill couldn't make it. But he's a really bright guy, but never learned to read. He was really nervous about coming, said he's gotten lost, gotten on the wrong plane multiple times. And he sends me this email, and he says, or at the first night of dinner, he says he keeps repeating these sort of, my brain is broken, and these sort of things. And I just stopped him and said, like really politely said, David, you got to stop trying to excuse this as something that we both know it's not. I understand that that's 60 years of programming. It's really hard to believe, but I can tell you're a really good guy. You're brilliant. Your brain is not broken. And I'm going to let Nora do her job because Nora's training him over the next week. And then you tell me after that, but let's just agree from now on, you're just going to stop saying that. He's like,
right.
All right. And he said, I really appreciate you saying that. So, all right, we're good. We're done. All right, we'll move on. And so I got an email from him and they filmed all the footage. And he said, Nick, you'd have no idea how much my anxiety's gone away. He said, I didn't realize how much this inability and this hiding all these things was causing problems with what I was doing, with everything else in my life. And it's just amazing that if you have inefficiencies in a certain area, how much you don't realize how much they're affecting every area of your life or could be. So I found that like firsthand, seeing it myself, I thought it was incredible. I want to talk for a second about your son. This is a great story. Your son, Jack, he goes to preschool. Teacher requests a meeting. You've even been working with him before preschool because you have these skills. And she says, I think he has a learning disability, and I will read the behaviors that gave her concern, and then you can talk. He would not sign in to class properly, so he would not write his name on the sign-in sheet properly. Number 2, he refused to stop playing to come to circle time when called. This is a 4-year-old or 3-year-old, whatever. And when shown any letter of the alphabet, he would always call it P. So tell me, when you got called in for this meeting, what went through your brain?
Well, it was just so well. First of all, you have to know my son because he's now 15, by the way, and I was slightly mortified that this story is in my book, but he's fine with it. He was powerfully reinforced by making people laugh. And it started early on with my daughter. I mean, it was like their thing because she was 5 years older than him. So anyway, so he was just very much a silly, hilarious, he still is, kid. So making people laugh was the best. And he was also like, as all kids are, he wasn't dumb and he was very sensitive to contingencies. So when he came into the classroom and all his buddies were already there playing in the corner, scribbling something really fast was a much easier thing to do and get to his playtime. And, pretending he didn't hear the teacher when he was called for circle time so he could continue to play with his trucks and they didn't make him come to circle time. So it worked, the payoff. And then I will tell you, potty humor was a huge thing in my house. And I will admit it, we created this monster. So he thought it was hilarious when he learned the letter P at FIT, because he was doing FIT learning for a long time before he started preschool. So he knew all his letters. I mean, I had school-proofed this kid, I thought. I forgot about the behavioral stuff. But anyway, so he thought it was hilarious that there was a letter that called P. That was like P that you did that made him laugh and made everybody else laugh. So every letter was P at school because he thought it was hilarious. So I knew all this, right? So I go in and it's very serious, like the whole school's in this meeting, right? Like the school psychologist and the director of early childhood development and the headmaster. And, it's this very serious meeting. They didn't really know who I was at this point, which was unfortunate for them. They didn't know their audience. So my husband and I, 2 PhDs in behavioral science, who know exactly what our son can do because we've been measuring it for a long time, coming in and they say all this stuff. So anyway, and of course their answer was to handle it outside the classroom, which is always is. So all these problems were occurring in this teacher's classroom, but the solution was to have him evaluated and then put in some kind of intervention outside the classroom, which, let's think about that. How does that make any sense, right? So of course, that's the first thing I went after. I said, well, okay, so it seems like this stuff's just happened in the classroom. Seems like the classroom is the problematic environment. Like we should probably address it inside the environment in which the problem's happening. Anyway, so long story short, it was, it went from neuropsychological evaluation and a label and a classification to he earns a star sticker every time he follows instructions and says his letters right. And then when he gets home, he can trade those in for like a Jolly Rancher I keep in the top of the cabinet, man. And guess what? In like 3 days, the kid was fine. It was like a no-brainer, stupid intervention. But it was this dramatic thing rather than let's evaluate what is the context in which the behavior is occurring. And firstly, and secondly, and most importantly, what's the payoff, man? What is the payoff? Like, so I asked her, what do you do when you tell him to come to circle time and he doesn't? She's like, well, I'll ask him again. And then on the third, when I ask the third time, I just know that he's just not ready. And I'm like, and he will never be ready. He will never be ready to leave his trucks and come to circle time on his own. That is never, you're going to be waiting until he's 61 years old. Like, so of course he's not coming to circle time because you ask him 3 times and nothing happens. Like try like prompting him to come to circle time and then praise when he does. Like that might be an easy solution.
I love the fact that you said when we were talking, when I was in New York City with you, you were talking about how, a thing to look out for as a parent who is being told their child has a learning disability is if their child learned everything else more or less fine at home. They learned how to walk, they learned how to talk. And by the way, they can even be a little bit delayed. I mean, we're not all ready to do the same things at the same times. But if a kid learns everything at home in and then goes to school and now all of a sudden can't learn, it's probably a school problem, not a kid problem.
You think? Like that, although the psychological establishment has done a very good job, selling this, reading disability, math disability, all these disabilities as things, it's not true. Because the learning process is actually the same regardless of what you're learning. So I don't care if you're learning to play a video game, if you're learning to play golf, if you're learning to play the violin, or if you're learning to read. It's the same fundamental process, which is the repeated reinforcement of behavior over time until it becomes neurologically permanent. And more importantly, the repeated reinforcement of component skills. So first things first. So like a kid doesn't pick up the violin and play Chopin. A kid learns, and the successful violin players learn this way, which is they learn the essential component skills to fluency first. So that's how you learn. I don't care what you're learning. And to be honest with you, it's not selective. So like I've worked with kids who have profound neurological learning problems, like kids on the autism spectrum, kids with severe Down syndrome, kids with acquired brain injury, kids with other kinds of, genetic conditions that have grandly impacted their neurology and their ability to learn from the environment. That they struggle to learn everything. They struggle to learn to walk, to talk, to feed themselves, to dress themselves, to do any adaptive skill. So if your child is learn to walk and talk and feed themselves and dress themselves and play with their buddies and play video games and the only thing they're struggling to learn is reading, I can't believe that the establishment's gotten away with it for this long. It's like you smell a rat. I mean, hello, like, suddenly they have, that's the one part of their brain that doesn't work is the reading part, which doesn't exist, by the way. There's no evidence that that's the case. So like, the reading part's the only part that's disabled. It's a joke. It's not true.
You talked about a couple of things that I thought were fascinating analogies. When we talked, you gave a video game analogy of a bunch of the kids that you come into your center to get help are fantastically good at video games, and talk about the difference in the structure in video games is not, you're old enough now, we're just going to move you to the next level, whether you did good at this game or not. Tell us about how that structure works and how it applies to education.
Well, and I think that should be the most empowering thing for parents, because, a lot of it's like video games are bad. I mean, and I'm a parent and I have a 15-year-old son. So man, Xbox is like a way of life in my house.
Yes.
Way of life. And my daughter's 20, but she went through that too. So, you know, I've been there as a parent and I've been there as a professional. So it's always bad news, you know, like too much screen time, that, you know, it's always that kind of stuff. But take a moment to hear some good news, which is that if your child is a proficient gamer, there is absolutely nothing wrong with your child's ability to learn. Like that is an unbelievable testament to your child's learning abilities. And you should watch them, actually. You should watch them play their video games, because I want you to get what is entailed in that. The coordination of systems that goes on, you know, digit coordination with, I mean, it is an unbelievably complex skill set that your child has acquired. And the reason they've acquired it is because video games are designed by people who are informed about behavioral science. They are not designed by people from the College of Education, man. I promise you that's not the case. Because video game designers have to design their games so that kids become good at playing them, so they'll play them more, so they'll buy them more. Like video game designers they do what works, because what works is what sells. That's it, period. And what works is designing a game based on the science behind how learning actually works. Otherwise, they'd be epic failures. I mean, kids would never think, why do you think kids hate reading and math and writing? Because they're so bad at it. And they're bad at it because it's not taught properly. So they don't get good at it. Kids love doing what they're good at. I mean, competency builds wanting to continue doing something. Being incompetent makes you want to avoid it. So kids become competent at video games because that's what they're designed that way. They're designed intentionally so kids can learn them. They can learn them quickly. They can get better at them, and they can advance to higher levels once they've mastered previous levels. That is the way they're designed. So video games are designed according to how learning actually works, which is they're broken down into finite skills. And they start at the most essential skills kids have to play the game, and they have to master those first. And then when they master those, they get to increase in the level, and they get to go to a harder world, or they get to go to a harder, they get to earn new weapons or do something harder. And then they have to master that level, and they move up the ladder. I mean, I was a Guitar Hero. I got up to expert level on Guitar Hero when Guitar Hero was a thing. Did you ever play Guitar Hero?
Yep.
I mean, if I had tried to play Guitar Hero starting at expert level, I would have thrown the guitar out the window. But I didn't. I started at the beginning level because that's how you have to. You're not allowed. You can't jump levels. They don't let you. So I became an expert Guitar Hero player, which is hilarious. And I'm actually not that proud of it because it does take a lot of practice. But I mean, am I talented? No, I just spent way too many late night hours avoiding doing doctoral level work playing Guitar Hero. And it was designed so I can master it. I mean, it's common sense, people. It is common sense.
You didn't have to play it in a classroom in front of a bunch of other kids and just blend in and then be embarrassed about saying, like with reading, at some point it becomes embarrassing for a kid in 3rd or 4th grade to have to sound it out loud because they haven't had enough repetitive instruction. So they just get sort of matriculated where they're failing in a way in this one skill, but it's proficient enough so they push them along. That's a big deal. I mean it's such a big deal. I love the way you explain that. Now the other thing I think is really interesting, you said something about and you talked about your son and his punishment. If a punishment isn't working, I thought it was mind-blowing how you talked about that. Like if a punishment isn't working, it's probably because it's not as bad of a punishment as the alternative to the kid. Tell me about the
or it's not a punishment at all. So I mean, that's there's certain things that have been kind of pulled out of behavioral science, and pediatricians are notorious for doing this. Like, so timeout, which I'm sure everyone's heard of, but timeout actually stems from behavioral science. That is a intervention that was developed and studied in my science, right? But pediatricians got wind of this and took it and then recommended to parents just blanketly. But what these things miss is what we call function. So behavioral function. So what behavioral function is a behavior only occurs at any strength because it's been historically followed by some type of reinforcement. So the function of that behavior is that what was reinforcing it to make it be in existence in the first place. So for instance, if a kid is given, clean out the dishwasher, go to your room, you're in timeout. Well, in that moment, the kid threw a tantrum. And again, I would never know from one occurrence. I'd have to evaluate, study the kid and see what the pattern is. But let's just say hypothetically that always happens. So the kid's asked to clean out the dishwasher, throws a tantrum, gets sent to his room. That's not a punisher. That's a reinforcer. What that means is that's actually reinforcing and strengthening and ensuring that behavior continues, because what has that child gotten out of it? Avoiding cleaning out the dishwasher. But because people don't understand function of behavior, they think timeout is a universal punishment. No, it isn't. Timeout is quite often a powerful reinforcer when escape from a demand is the reinforcer. Now, if a kid's at a play date with all of his best pals and he's like a 3-year-old and they're in the bite club and he bites another kid, and then he gets put in a playpen in the room and can see all of his buddies still having fun. This is exactly what I did with my son, Jack, by the way. So my son, Jack, liked to bite when he was in his cute little play group, and they were like 1 and 2 years old. And he had all his buddies, and we'd always take turns at whose house it was. And I brought my playpen everywhere, even when it was at my house. So when my son wanted a toy or wasn't happy with one of his buddies, he'd bite the kid. And my son would get picked up and put in a playpen in the middle of the play date so he could still see all the fun action happening in the room, but he just didn't get to engage. And so he was in a timeout for about 5 minutes. That's all it was. He would just sit there for 5 minutes. And I tried to train all the moms. It was very good for all the moms because they learned a lot of really cool things. I was like, just ignore. He's going to cry and make himself look really sad. Don't feel sorry for him. This is really important because it's not functional for him to bite kids. We're going to ignore him. So he would hang out in there when he was calm and sitting in his place. Then he got to come back out. And guess what? He stopped biting in a couple weeks. So that was an effective timeout. That was an effective punisher. Why? Because the behavior decreased. But if the behavior is continuing, if the behavior is promulgating, if it's getting worse, then you don't have a punisher. You've got a reinforcer working somewhere. So that's why behavioral function is so important to think about, right? Just because a lot of parents think reprimanding and lecturing is always a punisher. No, it isn't. A lot of kids love that attention from you. They love it. That's like heroin for a kid. I mean, literally. It's like, what have I told you? And, I'm getting mommy mad. That's like a little bit of you got to be careful. Sometimes your attention is like a little vending machine popping out candy bars. So that's why behavioral science is such a gift for parents, because you realize the power consequences hold for the behavior your kids engage in that drive you completely insane. And then you also hold the power to get rid of it. If you know how to do it.
And even whether it may not be a complete avoidance, it may be a delay of the dishwashing or whatever.
Yes,
and it may be a delay in a room with a cell phone or a TV or an Xbox or a book even. I mean, different kids respond differently, but I love that you speak pretty strongly. Again, anyone who's interested in this, check out Dr. Kimberly's stuff. There's lots of it online. Buy the book, Blind Spots, Why Students Fail and the Science That Can Save Them. You talk pretty strongly about many things, but also the psychological establishment and IQ tests and psychological testing. Tell me about the issue with these.
Okay. So, and this is one of the hardest things, the reason I call my book Blind Spots, by the way, is because, we all live in these two realms where we're very comfortable. So we live in the realm of what we know that we know, right? So I know I'm an expert in behavioral science, and I know I am not an expert in astrophysics. So I am very comfortable with what I know, what I do not know. And that's all fine. But the dangerous realm is the realm of what we don't know, we don't know. Because when we don't know something, then we have blind spots. We can't see because we don't even know there's something that we could be aware of or see something differently. So that's what blind spots. So one of the biggest blind spots that that mainstream psychology has created for the public is that psychological tests are actual evidence or directly measure the supposed inherent things that psychologists suggest they do. Like, so for instance, if you're like, let's take dyslexia, because I work with a lot of kids who have classifications of dyslexia, and don't even get me started. So I'm going to talk you through what this really entails. So a kid struggling to read, right, due to ineffective instruction and insufficient mastery of component skills. And I promise you that's why. But the teacher, of course, doesn't know this because they're blind spots, not trained that way, it's working inside of an ineffective system. There's many reasons. So the teacher sees a kid who's significant. I mean, every kid struggles to read. Look at our educational statistics. But then the ones that are really struggling the most get referred, right? Usually referred for having some kind of neuropsychological evaluation. So the parents, of course, don't know. Teacher's the expert. I'll do it. I should do it. So the parents take their child, or they might even ask their pediatrician, who also have blind spots and don't know this either because they're not trained in this stuff in behavioral science at all. So they might get referred for a neuropsychological evaluation. So here's what happens in a neuropsychological evaluation. A kid engages in a series of tests, right? Like some reading tests, some other tests. And what those tests actually measure is that child's performance. And another word for performance is their behavior. It's what they do. So they're presented with a test and they behave with respect to that test by completing it in whatever way they're supposed to. So what's actually measured by that test is the child's behavior, period. Now, when that psychologist has the tests completed and they get the child's score, then they make an inference about why the child performed that way, why those scores were super low or super high or average, whatever they were. The psychologist doesn't have access to the why at all. That hasn't been measured. That hasn't been directly observed. The why doesn't exist anywhere in that testing situation. All that exists is that child performed on a test, period. So then the traditional neuropsychologist or psychologist will then make an inference about the why. And they'll say, oh, well, this score is this low because your child has dyslexia. Dyslexia has never, not once, ever been measured in the history of humanity because it doesn't exist in the brain anywhere. It's a construct. It's not something that can be measured. The only evidence of dyslexia is the child's behavior with respect to reading material. Like a child behaves a certain way when they read, they flip some letters, they stick letters in when they shouldn't be there, or take them out when they should be, whatever. That's all behavior. That's all stuff kids do. And then a psychologist infers why they're doing it. And they say they're doing it because there's something wrong with their brain. And I'm going to call that dyslexia. It's never been measured. You can't see it. You can't point to it. It's never been a part of the evaluation. It's an inference. It's a theory. Another theory is the child hasn't mastered essential reading skills. And maybe they just need effective instruction, repeated reinforced practice. I don't know, maybe, right? But that's usually never offered. It's never it's not offered as well. One possibility could be that they have a learning problem, but another possibility could be it's usually presented as, okay, the test says this, and that means that dyslexia has been identified. But it's all really hypothetical and based in an inference. Like those tests don't measure neurology. That doesn't get directly measured at all. It's the child's behavior that's measured. And then an inference about why they behave that way is made. And that's why, I'm trained so behavioral science is a natural science. So we're more aligned with biology, chemistry, physics, neuroscience, not neuropsychology, neuroscience, which is very different. So as a natural science, we are trained first and foremost in skepticism. Secondly, we're trained in humility. And third, we're trained in looking for how we're wrong. Like I'm constantly trying to find where I'm wrong. I'm not trying to prove myself right all the time. I'm trying to find where I'm wrong because that's what scientists do. Because we know we never know all the answers. We know we've never completely answered a question. We know that there's always more to discover. That's the whole point of the scientific process. Dogmatism is the like science is the opposite of dogmatism. Like dogmatism comes from belief-based systems. When you believe something and you hold to it, no matter what anybody else says, it's your ideology. It's like your thing. And so you're on a quest to prove yourself right all the time. That's not how scientists are trained. Scientists are trained the other way, which is that you're skeptical about anything, even the evidence I produce with kids, even the outcomes I produce with kids. I'm always looking for where did it not work? Where did we not get it? Where did it break down? Where are we not doing that? How can we be better? We're always looking for where we're wrong. Do you know what I mean? So that's what really breaks my heart about the testing situation, because parents are given this diagnosis as if it's well, that's it. I've explained it. Your child's reading problem is because they're dyslexic, and I am an expert, and I'm telling you this, and there you go. Which is so shockingly wrong, because there's no evidence of that at all. All the evidence is that they struggle on a reading assessment, which is so silly, because the only reason they're in the neuropsychological evaluation is because they're struggling with reading in the classroom. So of course they struggled on a reading assessment. Really infuriating.
That's literally why they're there. I love it. Now, I'll have a couple minutes left. Everyone needs to check out your book, Blind Spots: Why Students Fail in the Science That Can Save Them. There is hope. There's things like precision teaching and direct instruction. Yes. Give a little bit of hope of what the results, when you get kids in there who are supposedly severe learning disabilities, lots of diagnoses, lots of ADD, and by the way, no one is disputing the fact that many of these things, learning disabilities, ADD, there's a very small percentage of people who have them, neurologically have them, but it's a much smaller than, way smaller than the diagnoses.
There's 20% that are classified.
What's that?
20% of school kids are classified, and less than 1% of kids have an actual neurological learning impairment. So 20 times too many kids are being classified.
Got it. So obviously you have a system. There's also other behavioral science systems. It's just a great way to learn. What do you say to parents out there to give them hope that, their kids in the 4th grade or the 7th grade or the 8th grade, and they're struggling and they have severe learning disabilities, particularly in 1 or 2 subjects, not all of them. What do you say to give parents hope, and what should they do?
Well, the first thing I would say is be empowered by knowing that your child most likely doesn't have a learning disability. That they have been failed instructionally, because that's how school is designed. So schools are designed based on exposing kids to lots of content and then moving on according to an arbitrary timeline, regardless of whether or not that content has been mastered. Mastery meaning, from a behavioral science perspective, that it's something we call fluent, or it demonstrates fluency, which means it's automatic, effortless, neurologically permanent, available for learning new and more complicated things, and so forth. So, school isn't designed to produce fluency in skills. It's not possible, because they move too fast, and they move kids according to age rather than mastery of prerequisite skills. So, being empowered by knowing that if your child struggles with math, there's not a math gene. There's all this stuff's made up. There's no reading gene and there's no math gene. Math and reading were human inventions. They were invented by humans to organize our world and advance our civilization. Math and reading, all academic skills, are human inventions that are passed down via instruction, not genetics. So if your child is struggling with academic skills, there's nothing wrong with them. What's wrong is that they've been probably not effectively instructed and haven't mastered basic skills, which actually is a really empowering thing to get. Because the first thing I do when kids come into FIT and have been given a classification, I give them the talk about doing versus having. Because when a kid has been given a learning disability and they're told they have dyslexia, they have dysgraphia, they have auditory processing disorder, whatever it may be, think about what that means. Like, you have strep throat, you have the flu, you have, cancer. That is a disease model that is terribly disempowering. I mean, horribly disempowering. And it's not only is it disempowering, but it also can become a scapegoat. It can become an excuse. There's so many things. So learning disabilities are a doing, not a having, because the only evidence for learning disabilities are things kids do. And the only thing to do is get them to do the more adaptive stuff and stop doing the stuff that's not working. So I have the doing versus having talk with kids all the time where I'm like, you don't have anything. Sometimes you mix up your B's and D's, and we're going to fix that with practice. So we're going to get you to not do that anymore. And we're going to get you to actually discriminate them correctly. Like, we're going to do that. So, the whole disease model, it's all theoretical, and it's a huge racket because that's $1 billion industry. $1 billion industry on this stuff that there's zero empirical evidence that they exist at all, because they're all constructs. They're names for things. Like a kid who reverses their letters and reads the wrong way sometimes, that's what all early readers do. The problem is when it doesn't get corrected and they're pushed ahead anyway, and then it becomes a big mess, and then they get labeled as having dyslexia, but dyslexia is not explained anything. That's just naming the behavior that they're engaging in. So being empowered by that and knowing that your child has evolved with an unbelievably complex system that is set up to learn from the environment. Like, look at all the amazing things your kid has learned outside of school. Think about it. I mean, amazing things your kid has learned outside of school. And then ask yourself, then why the heck is everything the school's in charge of what my kid struggles with the most? And then maybe you should ask yourself why that is. And, I'm telling you that the revolution that has to happen to change our educational system is going to have to start with a grassroots movement. It's going to have to be parents and teachers who have had enough, and they need to say enough is enough. And this has to change, or otherwise it's not going to change. So parents actually need to get upset. They need to get angry, and they need to stop being gullible. Like, don't believe it. If you're called into a teacher meeting and you're told that your child has reading disability, then say, okay, well, then explain to me why he can play any video game blindfolded, and why he's an expert lacrosse player, and he's whatever all the other stuff he does well. Like, the only thing he struggles to learn is stuff you're in charge of, and don't be afraid to say that. And because again, you got to take a stand. Teachers have to take a stand about their training, and parents have to take a stand about how their kids are being educated, and know that you're not alone. The establishment does an amazing job making parents feel like you're the only one who has a kid who struggles. And that's not by chance, that's by design. But a majority of kids struggle. It's the lucky few who don't. So you're not alone at all. You're the majority. Period.
Thank you so much. This and much more to be found in Dr. Kimberly's book, author of Blind Spots, Why Students Fail and the Science That Can Save Them. Kimberly, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, everyone, for joining us here on Now to Next, and we will see you next time. Take care.
Thanks, Nick.
Hey, Nick Nanton here, and thanks for tuning in to Now to Next. I want to make sure you don't miss a single episode of this show on YouTube. So before we continue, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. You have the option to be notified for occasional videos or all of them. If you're on your phone, just go into your settings and switch on notifications. Thanks for watching.